also a researcher at the Documentation Center. And at the Documentation Center, we work on political parties, as the name already says. And political parties play a very crucial role in our democracies. They form an important link between politics on the one hand and society on the other hand. The reason for organizing this lecture tonight is not just that there are elections around the corner, but in fact that this Documentation Center is now celebrating its 50th anniversary. So we've been around for 50 years already. I won't go into too much detail about the history of the Documentation Center. We will do that on the 26th of January. That is when we actually have a one-day symposium where we will celebrate it and also go a bit more into the history. But for those of you who don't know what we do, we are a very small team based over at the University Library on the top floor. You should come visit us. And we do three things. First and foremost, we collect and document everything about Dutch political parties, ranging from posters to manifestos and campaign material. So now is a very exciting time. We're collecting lots of fun stuff for parties. Second of all, we conduct socially relevant research with that material, and today you get a short glimpse of the type of research that we do. And thirdly, we offer insight into the functioning of Dutch politics and share these insights with the general public. And there's probably no better partner to team up with to do so than with Studium Generale. If you don't know them, they organize multidisciplinary activities for the general public, and that includes lectures, films, debates in the fields of science, culture, and society more broadly. Do sign up to their mailing list if you're not already signed up. But today is actually all about parties. We at the Documentation Center have actually a vested interest in the survival of political parties, because without parties, no Documentation Center. And we have a fantastic speaker lined up today, Susan Scarrow, who's one of the leading experts in the world, I would say, on party politics. But before I introduce her, I actually have some more sad news to share, which is that Professor Gerrit Voerman, who is the director of the Documentation Center, unfortunately could not join us here tonight due to illness. He sends his apologies, and for any of you who knows Gerrit, if he could make it, if there's any way he could have made it, he would have been here. So we're really sad he's not here, because it was also meant to be his party. As the director, he is also a walking encyclopedia on Dutch politics. He knows really everything you can know about Dutch parties, and I will very much miss him here tonight. It means that our evening will look a little bit different. Since I have been closely involved in the planning of this event, I think we've been working on this for 1 year. We've had many discussions in the run-up to the event, and I will take his place as discussant. Big shoes to fill. The bad news is that you therefore have to deal with me a bit more than you might have wanted, that you would have expected. But the good news is that I used a lot of Gerrit's input and knowledge and insights for my response. Because we have offices door to door, and we walk into each other's office with thoughts and ideas, and I hope that some of that could be brought to you still through this response that I will deliver afterwards. So the plan is as follows. Susan will open, speak for about 45 minutes on the future of political parties, the state of these parties, and I will then respond for about 15 minutes where we zoom in on the Dutch case. And then I will also open up with a few questions, and that should then open the floor for discussions. And I really hope to also hear some questions from students. I see that they are well represented here tonight, so don't be shy in asking questions. With all of that out of the way, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight. So we have Dr. Susan Scarrow here with us. She's a professor of political science at the University of Houston in the US. And her scholarship and teaching have focused on the comparative development of political parties and representation in parliamentary democracy, a true party animal, you could say. Her recent books include Beyond Party Members, Organizing Political Parties, Representation, Participation and Power. And she's also the co-director of the Political Party Database, which is a project involving researchers from more than 50 countries, which we at the Documentation Center also contribute to. And it's a wonderful resource for students and scholars who are interested in party politics. Please join me in welcoming Susan Scarrow.
Thank you for this invitation today. Am I on? Yes. It's a great honor to be here and really to celebrate this 50th anniversary. I was pleased to get the invitation, a little daunted by it. I was given a topic that it's equally daunting, which is to think about the future of political parties. So that's what I'm going to do today. And as background, I am not a scholar of Dutch politics. So you're all experts on Dutch politics. We will have discussion afterwards. You can say whether this fits, how it doesn't fit. My role is here as the comparativist and as the outsider to talk about more generally about parties in parliamentary democracies. And let me just begin with a quick overview of where this talk is headed. A basic premise of my talk tonight and in the title is that if we want to think about where parties are going, we should look backward to where they have been. What challenges have they had? How have they responded? What does this tell us about the potential for future responses? So after showing where things have been, I'll turn to the future. But let me start with the state of the parties. Got a slide up here? Yeah, okay. You can read this along as I read it out to you. Here's a diagnosis about the state of party-organized politics. In almost every country, the support for the principal established political parties has declined, and new parties, small parties, and anti-party movements have gained in strength. This failure of the party system to produce electoral and parliamentary majorities poses the question, how viable is democratic government without parties or with greatly weakened and attenuated parties? Okay, so most of you have heard something like this. This is a familiar lament. What may be more surprising is that the assessment was published almost 50 years ago. It was published as part of something known as the Trilateral Commission Report, rather infamous document at the time, and they were worrying about exactly the same things. So why? Why were they worrying in the 1970s about political parties? One reason is that 50 years ago, when this center was founded, there was a time of economic and political upheaval. And I want to start by recalling this. Some of you may remember, but many of you in the room do not recall it firsthand. But it's closely related to the evolution of thinking about political parties. So let's go back to 1973, and then 5 years before that, in 1968. It was a year of turmoil on both sides of the Atlantic. To name a few of the events that were happening that year, April started with the assassination of civil rights leader Martin Luther King, which was followed by uprisings in protests in many cities. In West Germany, there were protests. In Italy and France, students occupied the universities. In France, by May 1968, the trade unions joined, and Paris came to a standstill. In August of 1968, the Warsaw Pact troops rolled into Czechoslovakia, ending the Prague Spring reforms. And things were just getting started. Things didn't slow down for the next 5 years. Among the events making headlines were the Troubles in Northern Ireland, which then led to bombings in England. In Italy, you had the Red Brigades terrorists. In Germany, you had the Baader-Meinhof gang. And almost exactly 50 years ago, there was a military coup in Chile, which ousted an elected government. And on the economic front, almost 50 years ago today, was the start of the 1973 oil embargo, which started in response to an October Arab-Israeli war. The embargo ended over 2 decades of economic growth and ushered in a period that was then known as stagflation, a new term, which had combined inflation rising to over 14% in today's Eurozone and unemployment levels doubling. The electoral landscape was also in flux. Most notably, in December 1973, there was a landmark election in Denmark that brought 5 new parties into the parliament and ousted about half of the sitting members of parliament. Even the electorate itself changed. Between 1969 and 1981, most West European countries lowered the voting age to 18, and, remarkably, Switzerland decided that women could vote. Women were finally allowed to vote and to hold seats in the national legislature. So in short, when this institute was founded in 1973, things were in turmoil in the political and economic landscapes, both in Europe and across the world. People worried about how political parties and democracies in general were going to cope with all of these challenges. Put differently, it was an era that should look very familiar. It was much like our own. So how did scholars respond to this political turbulence? One common way was to see these changes through the very pessimistic lenses of party decline or even party failure. Typical of this was the pessimistic quotation I showed a few minutes ago, but it wasn't just scholars on the right who were seeing problems. For instance, another more left-leaning political scientist in 1979 wrote, "Among the institutional failures of the past decade, those of the political parties stand out as critical." And a famous volume of the 1980s was titled simply, "When Parties Fail." Now, there wasn't a standard definition for party decline, let alone for party failure, but the common thread was there was a growing gulf between parties and citizens. This disconnect was seen as producing electoral fragmentation and political instability. Not everyone agreed with the label of decline, but everybody agreed that there was a great deal of political change happening and that political parties were at the center of it. So to understand where these changes may be headed today and what, if anything, parties can do about them, we need to know what's causing the changes. We can't just look at the symptoms, because as with symptoms of illness, there can be different causes that produce similar symptoms. And if you want to cure the malady, you have to know what's causing the symptoms. I'm going to focus on 3 different diagnoses that are often given, that are often linked to the same symptoms of what's going on, what has been challenging the parties. And these diagnoses, these explanations, fall into the categories of social revolutions, participation revolutions, and elite failures. I'm going to show evidence from the past 50 years to show the development of the symptoms that are usually linked to these diagnoses. I'm going to use evidence from 13 West European parliamentary democracies, which I've chosen because they were parliamentary democracies in 1973, and they're going forward. So to make our comparison easy, let's stick with the same 13 countries and look over time. Of course, that limits the scope of my conclusions, so you may want to challenge me on that, but I think it gives an easy way to summarize how things have changed. So let's start with the social revolutions diagnosis. This diagnosis highlights 2 types of social changes and said they are responsible for undermining the stable party systems of the 1950s. First, social cleavages were becoming less relevant for elections. Most notably, social class loyalties were blurring so that you had trade union members becoming less likely to vote for left parties, and you had white-collar workers becoming more likely to vote for those left parties. So there was that blurring, but also at the same time, fewer people fell into those traditional categories. Secularization made religion less important. There were fewer agricultural workers. There were fewer industrial workers. In response to these kinds of changes, political parties, the traditional mass political parties, adopted catch-all strategies, just as Kirchheimer had predicted. In other words, they started seeking votes beyond their traditional cleavage strongholds, and by doing this, they also further weakened the cleavage basis of politics. So that was part of the social revolutions diagnosis. The second kind of revolution that was going on in society was what political scientist Ronald Inglehart labeled the silent revolution, which was an ongoing shift in value priorities, under which younger generations were placing much higher value on individualism and self-fulfillment, and then these new values made the collective identities associated with traditional cleavage parties much less attractive. Okay, so that was the diagnosis. What were some of the symptoms supporting this diagnosis? I'm going to show you 3 indicators showing how elections have become less predictable. First is a measure of electoral volatility. This is a standard measure that sums up the gains by one party and controls for the fact that one party's gain is another party's loss. Greater volatility means less stability. This figure, like several that follow, is going to give a picture of now and then by taking an average, what was happening in the 3 elections before 1974 and what's happened in the 3 most recent elections. So just to give a snapshot here of then and now. And what you see in this picture is that there's been an increase in volatility. So the blue bar is longer than the orange bar, to put it simply. And the top shows the average for all the countries, but all the countries have the same pattern, that there is now more volatility. A second kind of indicator has to do with the effective number of parties. The effective number of parties is a measure that tells us how dispersed competition is. So if you have 2 really big parties and several small parties, it's going to be something like a 2.5 party system, because mostly the competition is about those 2 big parties. But if you have 5 parties that are all exactly the same size, it's going to be a 5-party system. So this tells us something about how easy or hard is it to know what the coalitions are going to look like afterwards. And again, we see all these countries, there's an expansion of the effective number of parties. Political competition has become a little less concentrated. What we also see is that people are voting for different parties. In all these countries, some of the most recent vote is going to parties that were new as of sometime after 1973. So there's been a new party system going. Voters are choosing new parties. They can't be loyal to parties that weren't there, so they're choosing new parties. To some extent, something like the bottom there is Italy. They have completely new parties compared to what things looked like in 1973. So to summarize, the social revolution's diagnosis said, society is changing, therefore we see elections change. And this de-alignment of society produces de-alignment of elections. Okay, that was diagnosis number 1. Diagnosis number 2 says, no, it's about participation revolutions. Much of what is happening has to do with citizens turning their back on political parties. They're less interested in the kind of participation offered by political parties. They're more interested in the less hierarchical, more immediate participation offered by social movements. And social movements are what was leading some of the most important political movements of the 70s and 80s. Anti-nuclear movements or women's movement were being led not by parties, but by social movements. So the argument went, people are turning their backs on political parties. They're not getting disengaged from politics, but they're getting disengaged from partisan participation. Another variation of this was given by Robert Putnam around the turn of this century, who said, it's not just parties, people aren't joining anything. So people are turning their back on organized participation. And then a more recent version of this has gone, oh, no, people don't want to do anything in person anymore. It's a digital revolution, and this will threaten parties because it's hard to get people to show up for campaigns, to participate, to meet their neighbors. They just want to be online. So that also threatens parties and their traditional ways of doing things. So again, let's look at some of the symptoms associated with this diagnosis. One of these has to do with turnout. So elections are party organized participation. And so one of the arguments goes, declining turnout reflects people turning their back on partisan politics. And indeed, we see that all of our countries have experienced at least some decline in their average turnout in elections. People aren't going to the polls the way they used to, although it should be noted that that's in some countries more than others. But if you want this long-term picture, you say, well, yeah, it's supporting that. The other common form of evidence mentioned with this kind of argument is party membership. So that's the ultimate form of party-organized political participation. And here we see, again, a large decline in the share of the population, of the voting age population, that has chosen to enroll in political parties. We see this in every country, a big decline. And I could make some excuses for this. In some publications I've said I don't think it's as big as these numbers show, but it's clearly a decline. So to sum it up, we have the participation revolution saying party decline is happening because people aren't engaging with parties. They don't want to get involved, and therefore they don't want to vote, and this partly explains the volatility. Different people are voting in different elections. So we have a kind of circle going on because people aren't as motivated by parties anymore in how they choose to participate. Third argument, what's going on? It's the elites who are to blame. This argument says that much of the growing gulf between citizens and parties is because of the political class. And we have here this wonderful headline about an Irish politician, a former Prime Minister of Ireland. He lied and lied and lied again. But you could probably find similar headlines in papers in many different languages if you wanted to look over the past 20 years. This kind of elite failure argument says it's politicians' corrupt behavior which is to blame. Another well-known early example was the so-called Tangentopoli investigations into Italian politics for their corrupt financial practices. And I noted earlier about the complete turnover of the party system in Italy. That was related to those scandals. So that's one argument about elite failures. A more subtle argument comes from political scientists Richard Katz and Peter Mayer in their cartel party argument that has been very influential. According to this argument, established parties used political institutions to insulate themselves from the kinds of changes previously shown. And part of this insulation was introducing public subsidies for political parties. In response to falling memberships and rising campaign costs, parties used their legislative positions to introduce these subsidies, and in turn, these new financial resources enabled them to professionalize their operations and thus encourage them to neglect their grassroots organizations. Also, in another kind of institutional turn, elites also supported changes to party governance structures to give leaders more flexibility in a more volatile electoral environment. Again, according to this argument, one such change took important decisions away from party congresses and instead balloted members directly, which parties proudly described as increasing intra-party democracy, but the cartel party argument tells us that these were actually Trojan horses, which decrease grassroots control and make parties more leader-centric organizations. And leader-centrism results in presidentialism, which further erodes the loyalty attached to party labels. So we have these kind of diagnoses. Again, what's the kind of evidence? Certainly, we see the spread of public subsidies for political parties, which are almost unknown in Europe before 1965. By the year 2000, they provided the main source of revenue for most political parties in our countries, and still do today. Similarly, membership ballots were barely used in European political parties before 1990. Now they've become much more common. This just gives a sample of some of the parties using them to select their party leaders. Hasn't spread universally, but certainly what was rare has become common. In other words, we certainly have evidence of the spread of the mechanisms that are said to aggravate this sort of party decline, and there's evidence of the associated symptoms. Now, I've already mentioned the decline of party membership, which is often associated with this type of argument. But whereas for the participation revolution argument, it's seen as a drying up of citizen interest in joining parties, for the elite failures argument, it's seen as a decline of elites' interest in recruiting members into parties. Now, of course, both things are possible, but again, if we're talking about symptoms and diagnosing how to treat the malady, what's going on makes a difference for how parties might respond. Survey data is also commonly used to show how elite failures have produced citizen disengagement. And let me show another kind of commonly used figure. There's much survey data on how much do citizens trust various political institutions. This is an example of it. And parties always come at the bottom. So if you're looking for evidence of party failure, the fact that parties are the least trusted political institution can be a good support for your argument. So to sum up, according to the elite failure explanation, it's parties themselves that bear much responsibility for party decline. Okay, so I've given 3 diagnoses. I've showed evidence that all of our countries have experienced long-term changes which support these arguments about party decline, about the weakening of bonds between parties and citizens. So in light of this, how should today's parties respond if they want to make themselves more fit for the future, as the title says? But to answer this, I'm going to again go to some more recent history, because what we want to know is if these trends are continuing. I've shown you 50 years of evidence, but what about now? What's happening in recent years? And for this, I'm going to be talking mostly comparing what's happened the first elections in this century versus the most recent elections. So basically 2 decades. And the question is the decline continuing, or do we have some new equilibria in place? So in terms of the indicators of electoral de-alignment, that instability, we can go back to these and say the volatility in the elections, between elections, is still increasing. Some countries, it's slowed down, but many countries are still quite volatile in the most recent elections, even compared to those of a decade earlier. We certainly see a party system fragmentation continuing to grow in most of our countries, so election outcomes are becoming more dispersed, and again, this can complicate coalition formation. What we see less of is new party creation. So the instability seems to be among parties that are at least more than 10 years old. So it's not a new set of parties everywhere. But again, we see basically that instability trends continuing if we look at these the diagnoses associated with the social revolutions. The diagnoses associated with the participation revolutions suggests that things may have stabilized a bit. For instance, if we look at turnout between these elections, we see a much more mixed picture here. Turnout has gone down in some countries from the first decade to the second decade, and it's gone up in others. So we don't have a singular trend here. And there may be a somewhat similar story with party membership. Although our data isn't quite as good for the party membership in the sort of the 2000s versus the 2020s, we don't have as good a comparison. But what we do know, for one thing, is that party membership was so low already in most countries, it didn't have very far that it could fall. So that's one kind of stability. All right, it's one kind of stability. And then we have also some parties that we see sort of incidents where they have a big surge in membership, we also see many new parties, and particularly populist parties, are organizing memberships. So some of the new parties are still relying on this mechanism of membership. So we may have a new equilibrium, albeit a low one, and data on, if you ask people surveyed, have you worked in a political party in the last 12 months? What the data from this also shows, it certainly hasn't been going down since the first part of this century, and it may be going up in some countries, at least until the pandemic, which we don't have the most recent data. So maybe some stabilization there. We also could say, in terms of one of the symptoms associated with elite failures, the trust in political parties, again, it's not going down and it's going up in some countries. So maybe there's some kind of stability there. So, to the extent that we see some stabilization, does this reflect parties' responses to change? In terms of the de-alignment associated with the social revolution's diagnosis, let me note that even though we still see all this volatility, there are some other indicators that suggest that parties can still generate some affection, even although we have volatility. If we ask people, do you have a preferred party? Can you name a party that you feel somewhat close to? In most recent surveys, at least 2/3 of the respondents had an answer for that question. And in many countries, the number who could do so rose slightly in recent years. So people have some idea of what parties they like. And other research has shown that when people go to vote, the parties they vote for are a pretty good match politically for what you'd expect them to vote for. They're not just voting randomly, they are voting in a rather informed way. So voters' ability to identify a party that matches their preference doesn't just happen by chance. And it's not just all because everybody's using voter advice apps to go find parties. And again, this is in a situation where there's new parties coming. So how are people finding a party that matches their preferences? Well, one way is almost certainly that parties became more professionalized and they're doing a lot of work on communication. They're working to get their messages out. With more votes up for grabs, parties' election campaigns have become much more important. They've also become increasingly professional. Parties' capacity to professionalize has owed a lot to the party subsidies, as I've already said. But here's where we get to some of the differences resulting from how we diagnose what's driving party decline. The elite failures diagnosis would say, well, the party subsidies and the professionalization are part of the problem. They are driving parties away from citizens. But from a social revolution perspective, the same subsidies can be seen as successful adaptations. After all, it's the electorates who are becoming more fluid, and it's the parties that are responding by trying to get their message out. They're having to work harder to convey their messages to people. In this account, parties' improved communication may explain why we don't see even more volatility and more confusion in the electoral environment. More, or perhaps less speculatively, the stabilization in partisan participation patterns that I showed earlier might also result in part from parties' responses, because parties have been trying to make party membership more accessible. They've been opening their participation to non-members. They've been trying to make participation more meaningful by introducing membership ballots. This may be part of the reason that we see more people are getting engaged, or at least we've got some flatness in that decline in partisan participation. And finally, it's worth noting one way that parties did not respond in general. They did adapt to the digital revolution, but only up to a point. So all parties have added web pages, they've added digital communication, they're doing targeted online social media, but they aren't becoming the German Pirate Party or the Italian Five Star Party that said, no, we're only going to be online and we're going to be digital platforms and the membership are going to join through these platforms and decide everything online through online voting, which it turned out that the elites weren't listening anyway. So that probably wasn't happening even for those parties, but we haven't seen it happening wholesale for any of the more established parties. Probably we'll see more of it, but that's not so far it's not, the wholly digital party doesn't seem to be the future either. Before concluding with some speculation about where parties might want to head next, let me add a bit more nuance to this discussion by questioning whether party decline or party failure are even the right labels. I'm not sure they are. Decline implies that things once were better. Indeed, some scholars refer to the 1950s as the golden age of parties. But the 1950s aren't necessarily the benchmark for how representative democracies should work. And if we wanted to write a different story about the past half century, we might be able to write one that focused on party system responsiveness rather than on decline. While electoral volatility clearly complicates life for individual parties, a certain amount of electoral volatility is a good thing for a political system, because overly loyal voters can become inattentive and not hold elites accountable. In permeable party systems, where established parties are worried about new party entry, they have strong incentives to pay attention to emerging issues. In other words, even if today many people are worried about the dangers posed by electoral instability, it's worth remembering that there are also costs for too much stability. But that said, my theme today is decline. I'm going to stick with that. And the weakening of links between citizens and parties certainly threatens the individual parties. So even if the party system as a whole continues to provide representation, the individual parties which want to survive and keep on serving their supporters need to think about what they can do to combat these trends. So in this final and more speculative section, let me draw some lessons from each of the diagnoses, taking them in reverse order. So perhaps the most important lesson for parties from the elite failures diagnosis is don't engage in corrupt and self-enriching behavior. Right, that seems obvious, but apparently it needs to be stated. So let me start with stating that. But beyond that, the diagnosis argues for institutional solutions that might strengthen parties' interest in cultivating grassroots organizations. One place to implement this would be in conjunction with party subsidies, which I know is being talked about in this country already. How do you do this? Well, subsidy rules can be set up to encourage parties to invest in the grassroots. For instance, by paying subsidies as a match for small donations, or by creating funding vouchers, which citizens give to a party of their choice. So they designate where they want the public monies to go. These solutions have already been tried in a few places, limited, but there's room for experimentation. In response to the participation revolution, many parties already have adjusted their approaches to party membership, and these reforms have helped some parties to identify and energize new supporters, at least for a while. But parties are always going to be competing for supporters' free time, so they're probably always going to have to be reinventing how they do parties and how they attract people to get involved. Certainly, part of the answer is they're going to need to push back against the stereotype that the only reason to get involved in a political party is because you want a political career. That there has to be something meaningful in it besides the transaction and the training for political life. The social revolution's diagnosis identifies the most difficult challenges for parties. As Kirchheimer predicted in the 1960s, parties have responded to the loosening of political loyalties, either by taking a catch-all approach, broadening their political appeals, or by pursuing niche party strategies. And neither approach has stabilized the party systems, as we've seen. In other words, some countries may be facing the limits of the catch-all strategy, as Kirchheimer himself foresaw might happen. So, if the catch-all strategy has reached its limits, what are the alternatives? One possible response comes from scholars with views on representation that differ a bit from those which have dominated these discussions of party decline. So much of the literature on party decline focuses on parties' failing capacity to provide linkage between citizens and the state. The linkage model of representation equates representation with responsiveness. Democratic linkage is primarily a bottom-up process in this telling. In this view, top-down linkage is manipulative and anti-democratic. It's something associated mostly with one-party states. So put differently, much of the party decline literature views party-based representation as a principal-agent relationship. Party failure arises when parties become unreliable agents. They don't act on behalf of citizens. This principal-agent model of representation is dominant, but it's certainly not the only way to think about how parties represent. Political theorist Lisa Dish has recently invited us to rethink representation by highlighting how parties and other political actors shape the political landscape. They foreground some conflicts, they exclude other interests and ideas. According to her, creating constituencies is a central and inevitable part of representation. Indeed, Creating Constituencies is the title of her book. She rejects the idea that society and social groups are given from which politics arises. In her view, realist views of representation, top-down messages inevitably help shape citizens' priorities and their identities. This is what representatives do. They help people figure out how to relate to the political world. It's not manipulation, but it's presenting perspectives that people identify with and help them organize the way to think about how they fit into politics. Viewing representation from this perspective puts a different spin on the social revolution explanation for party decline. In this telling, high electoral volatility and perpetual de-alignment aren't the inevitable result when old cleavages fade. Instead, they exist because parties haven't yet crafted compelling new political identities which would lead to at least some kind of realignment. This idea of parties as identity-creating actors has links to earlier views of parties' role in representation. For instance, in the 1950s and 1960s, functionalists argued that parties could, and in some cases did, contribute to political life by providing what they labeled political integration. Political scientist Sigmund Neumann went further and argued that democratic integration was an essential activity for democratic parties. In Neumann's views, which were deeply influenced by his experiences in Weimar Germany, democratic parties were facing anti-democratic parties. And these anti-democratic parties succeeded by offering their supporters political communities and motivating visions of a better society. So for Neumann, pro-democratic parties needed to compete by cultivating their own communities, ones which motivated supporters by invoking shared long-term aims, not just short-term individual interests. The message that democratic parties should embrace democratic integration resonates today when democratic parties are again facing competition from parties that seem marginally committed to the democratic order. The success of new populist parties, along with the rise and endurance of some identity-based niche parties, also cast doubt on what had become another settled belief among political scientists by the end of the 20th century, namely that parties are no longer necessary for providing political integration. In some cases, people argued parties were no longer capable of providing that integration. But the polarization that we see in the US politics, so I've experienced, seems directly related to the ability of one party to reshape the identity of some of its supporters, ones who then proudly wear MAGA hats and fly Trump flags. It's a Trump Republican Party, but it's a Republican Party. And we've seen similar recent examples for many democracies. Whether or not we like the visions these parties promote, we shouldn't ignore the evidence that many citizens seem hungry for parties that effectively use narratives and symbols to shape these new political constituencies. So let me be very clear here. I'm not suggesting that democratic parties should promote their own leadership cults, and I'm also not suggesting that we should go back to Neumann's mass party organization. But I am suggesting that parties may want to invest more in promoting long-term visions, one whose content goes beyond the narrow goal of defeating their supposedly anti-democratic rivals, or even their democratic rivals. But it also means that they may want to explore grassroots organizational changes that embrace the idea that representation is about identity creation as well as about responsiveness. So again, if you let members vote, it's not just digital voting. Maybe it's about voting that requires people to come together in a meeting beforehand, so you're creating community. But I said this was a speculative conclusion, and I can't say exactly what this would look like because undoubtedly it would look different for different parties. There's no one right way to have a party. What I do want to leave you with is the message that thinking about representation in this way yields a slightly more optimistic view of what is possible. This perspective highlights that parties have the power to reinvent their relations with voters. It says that parties aren't doomed to marginalization due to citizens' shifting preferences and identities. Parties can also help shape these preferences and identities, not through manipulation, but by offering attractive alternatives. This perspective says that democratic parties should embrace the work of creating constituencies and of promoting democratic political integration. They should not leave it to anti-democratic parties to do this work. So, thank you.
How's everyone doing? Can you handle a bit more input? Yes, thank you. All right, on behalf of Gerrit and on behalf of everyone, I think, I would like to thank Susan for her very clear and challenging analysis of the changing position of political parties in relation to their electorates in Western Europe in the last 50 years. So her analysis started in 1973, which is also the year the Documentation Center was founded. Both Gerrit and myself, we found your approach in which you distinguish between these three strands of diagnosis very persuasive. So by differentiating between these social revolutions, participation revolutions, and elite failure as causal mechanisms, you're actually able to demonstrate to what extent parties have to adapt to external factors. I like this quote which says, parties are like sharks in the water. They have to change all the time to circumstances. So really fundamental societal changes, as was the case with the two aforementioned revolutions. And to what extent they have also had to look for the causes of their decline in themselves. So this can also be referred to as internal factors. Your analysis is based on a very wide selection of empirical data regarding the party systems of 13 Western European countries, which are all long-standing parliamentary democracies. And the overall picture that emerges from this analysis is one of party decline. If there's one takeaway message, it's that. But the Dutch case, I would say, fits very well into this pattern, as you've also indicated yourself. And in my response, which is based also on Gerrit's input, so he's with us here, I take the blame, but he takes the credit. What I want to do now is I want to briefly zoom in on the Dutch case, on a particular case of the Netherlands, showing a few slides that actually demonstrate the evolution of Dutch political parties over time on the basis of the indicators that you have chosen, and also with an eye on the upcoming elections, because we are all in election fever here in the Netherlands. If you are expecting a forecast, I have to disappoint you, or maybe I should say I have to reassure you, because I do not have a crystal ball, and in fact, political scientists are notoriously bad at making any sorts of predictions. I will end by raising 3 questions, and that should also serve to kick off our discussion for tonight. Now, let me start by zooming in on the Dutch case. How have societal changes, so the external factors that you mentioned, manifested themselves in Dutch politics? And I want to start with the social revolutions. And I have here a slide that shows net electoral volatility. Well, we just learned that this measures the overall changes in individual parties' vote share from one election to the next. And what you see in the graph clearly is that there are substantial increases in net volatility in the Netherlands over the past half century, and especially from the 1990s onwards. This high level of volatility seems to have become the new normal here. And we also see that new parties entering parliament, in fact, contribute to that volatility. And that can actually be interpreted as a sign that the programmatic supply of the parties represented in parliament is not sufficient, something that is a bit paradoxical given that we have so many parties on offer here in the Netherlands. And all of this makes Dutch election outcomes far less predictable. So once again, predictions are not something we are good at, and in particular because of this what we call volatility. And that confirms Susan's analysis. And the second indicator that I would like to discuss is about the effective number of parties, and I also have a slide for this. This measure expresses the absolute number of parties in parliament in relation to their relative number of seats, which we also just learned. And in the Netherlands, the effective number of parties, you see this line in blue, it doubled from 4 in the 1980s to 8 in 2021, which shows us the increasing fragmentation of Dutch parliament. And this, of course, has made it far more difficult to form effective governing majorities, not to mention the fact that these government coalitions then regularly also lack workable majorities in the Senate. I won't even talk about, for this election, what that could mean. So in addition to the rise of volatility, we have also seen a rise of fragmentation. And here's a fun fact. These 2 trends are particularly pronounced in the Netherlands. So it's sometimes referred to as the Dutchification of politics. We are a trendsetter in the Netherlands when it comes to volatility and fragmentation. It's partly due to the fact that we have an extremely proportional electoral system, but also because of these changing participation preferences. And that brings me to the second point, the second external trend that you mentioned, namely these participation revolutions. First, I want to show you the turnout. So turnout, as you mentioned, is often regarded as a sign of diminishing interest in partisan politics because political parties play a central role in the electoral process. Turnout decline in the Netherlands was small, at least at the general elections. That's the green line, the top one. In terms of turnout, the Netherlands seems to somewhat deviate from most other countries that were included in Susan's analysis. Good news, I guess. Then I have also the declining membership situation. So, as we have seen, membership often is seen as an indicator or a symptom for party decline, sort of the canary in the coal mine situation. And Susan mentioned that in most countries, membership fell by 50% or more in the 1970s to the first decade of the 21st century. The Dutch case deviates to a certain extent from this general pattern. Now, at the Documentation Center, we collect membership data. Every year we do this. We basically call parties and ask, what's your membership looking like? And then we can make figures like this and also measure trends over time. And this trend shows us that, taken together, from the 1980s to the late 2010s, Dutch parties lost about a third of their members. Less than 3% of voters in the Netherlands are a member of a political party. However, that will my next slide show, this loss is a bit more nuanced. If we open the black box to see where does this loss come from, we can see that it's actually mainly attributable to the 3 so-called pillar parties, our traditional parties, the Liberal, VVD, the Labour Party, PvdA, and the Christian Democrats, CDA. So these three traditional parties, party families, all of which can be seen as these cleavage-based parties, seem to indicate that the social revolutions perspective is actually also relevant here to understand the decline in membership. But recently, and that's something that you can see in the tiny orange line in the back, recently, we actually saw that there is an increase in party membership to 380,000 in total. And this growth is largely due to the far-right populist party Forum for Democracy, which has entered parliament in 2017 and rapidly become the largest party by membership in the Netherlands, with more than 60,000 members. Although the joint absolute membership for Dutch parties has fallen considerably, the decline in general is less steep than perhaps elsewhere. And I will come back to this point with my questions. But that now brings me to the internal factors. How have parties contributed to their own downfall? We talked about elite failure, and in the elite failure perspective, the so-called cartel party argument from Katz and Mehr plays an important role. So this is the idea that parties have grown closer to the state and further away from society, and that established parties made use of political institutions to insulate themselves from many of the political effects of the social changes that were part of the aforementioned revolutions. Again, the Dutch case fits well with this perspective. And here I show you the public funding. So in the 1970s, public funding for parties was introduced in the Netherlands. Initially only for affiliated organizations like scientific foundations or youth organizations, but from 1999 onwards, also for political organizations, for the party itself. So parties have indeed become more dependent on the state. At the same time, in the early 2000s, party members were empowered in Dutch parties, meaning that party congresses, which were traditionally composed by delegates of the branches, were transformed into conventions in which all members had the right to speak and vote. In many parties, members also acquired the right to elect party leaders directly, suggesting that intra-party democracy overall in many parties increased. All things considered, a more detailed investigation of the Dutch case confirms Susan's most important findings. We can indeed observe a party decline in the Netherlands, but there is a little room to question the diagnosis. And that brings me to my first question. The cartel party diagnosis is based on a rather cynical view that party elites play a role in their own downfall. So according to Katz and Mehr, who came up with the diagnosis, elites decided at some point to introduce public funding for their parties, not only to professionalize their organizations, but also in their election campaigns, but also to bypass the grassroots organizations. So state subsidies make them financially independent from the party on the ground. And at the same time, party elites give members at the grassroots level formally more direct influence on party matters, however, only to bypass the intermediate level of the mid-level party elite, which arguably is less docile, less prepared to follow the party leadership than ordinary members. And so my first question then is whether that negative view of party elites is actually warranted. Do you think this approach is tenable as an explanation for party decline? Or to put it bluntly, can party elites really be blamed for the decline? That does not mean, of course, that party elites do not have their own agenda or do not make mistakes. On the contrary. Some years ago, the State Commission on the Parliamentary System, as you can see here, in the Dutch parliamentary system, concluded in this report that substantive representation fell short. So the views of higher educated MPs with regard to crucial political topics like immigration and European integration aligned closely with those of higher educated voters, but far less with the lower educated voters. And of course, party elites can be held responsible for this mismatch because they dominate the nomination process. And this defective representativeness of their parties can undermine trust in parties and foster party decline. Now, in order to make the parliamentary system more representative, the Commission advised institutional reforms, like the introduction of a corrective binding referendum and assigning greater weight to preference votes for individual candidates. It is interesting to note that in your presentation, you do not explicitly take into account this institutional context in which parties operate, so presidential or parliamentary systems, majority or proportional representation, referendums or not. It suggests that you probably don't consider these differences to be particularly relevant. But in the Dutch case and in the Dutch debate at the moment, precisely institutional solutions are presented by certain political parties. So in the Dutch debate, changing the electoral system or introducing referendums is very popular, seen as a remedy to reconnect parties to their citizens. And in fact, we have a newcomer party that is currently leading the polls that is very popular partly because of these institutional innovations. And so my question is, in light of your analysis, do you think that the Netherlands are seeking their solution in the wrong direction? And then the third and final point I would like to raise is, of course, about populism, which you do not deal with in great depth in your presentation, but that happens to be my hobby horse. So in the Dutch parliament at the moment, we have at least 4 populist radical right parties, depending on how you count and how you want to apply the definition. And in the last elections in 2021, they received altogether to about 25% of the vote. And here I dare to make a tiny prediction, with a grain of salt, which is that there probably is not enough room for 4 shades of right-wing populism in the Netherlands. In other words, these parties, I think, are too similar to sustain themselves. My guess is that 2, maybe 3 of them will be left, but in any case, the populist radical right bloc will thin down a bit in the coming elections. This brings me to my question. Populism is, of course, often seen as a symptom of the growing disconnection between parties and voters. But populist parties might also play a more autonomous role in mobilizing discontent, notably by fiercely criticizing the established parties in a way that undermines voters' trust in political parties and the political system as a whole. At the same time, one of these parties, which I mentioned before, has managed to become the biggest party by membership. So when we talk about party decline, shouldn't we focus a bit more on the role of populist parties as amplifiers of political distrust? Or, maybe to put it more bluntly, do populist parties represent the nail in the coffin for the age of party politics, or can they be seen to revitalize the matter somehow? Thank you. I would like to give Susan a moment or a chance at least, to respond to this fierce criticism of mine. So you are free to respond. And then after that, I would like to ask the floor for questions. So gear up already with some questions.
Good. Well, I'm not going to answer all of those big questions because they're great questions, and I do look forward to hearing. I think everybody has an opinion on where things should be going, and then also maybe an optimistic or pessimistic idea of where they're likely to go, regardless of what you think should. The question of can or should party elites be blamed for party decline, I will say, I think that may give party elites too much credit. Right? I mean, are they really steering this car in some way or other, or are they responding? And I think they are being more reactive to things. And I do think it's also maybe overestimating how professionalized parties are. When I looked at those budgets for how big the party subsidies are, I bet that's less than the budget of this university. Yeah. So by far, right? So if you think of that, of all the parties in this country are supposed to be doing things like thinking about what we might talk about in academic terms, we talk about first-generation students. And in some ways, you're talking about getting people mobilized who aren't easily mobilized because of their higher education and their higher leisure time. Well, universities invest a lot in trying to get people who aren't traditional students to come to universities and to succeed. They have to invest extra resources because for some people it's more easy than others, and so they try to motivate participation in the academic world. Well, parties don't have a lot of extra resources or professionals who are able to do that kind of thing. So if you think of it from that point, like how can parties be thinking about, other than their messages, of course, but for their organizations, they don't actually have that much extra capacity to invent big organizations. So I think that parties in some sense are blamed for not being able to do things that are very difficult to do. So that would be, but yeah, don't be corrupt. I mean, again, I think there are, but don't be corrupt also gets me to another kind of institutional reform, because some of the corruption that parties are blamed for has to do with new rules on party financing that were introduced as part of the party subsidies, that practices that used to be okay in the past, well, at least they weren't illegal, and everybody was doing them. Now they're illegal and publicized, and people get tried for them, which is actually a success of the political system, even though nobody wants to put it that way. We have prosecutors who are willing to hold politicians accountable to the law. And so some of what's happening when those things happen and make headlines, and there are investigation commissions, this is partly a success of the system, that people are holding other people accountable, that they're introducing new ethical standards, and then they start enforcing them. Not entirely, but things change, and maybe in a positive way. Certainly financial transparency of political party finance is a huge change over the past 50 years. It didn't exist at all 50 years ago. So I would say, not all the institutional reform is going to be happy, but I think it should be strengthening parties, but conversely, it's not. So is institutional reform the right tool to address party decline? All the things you were mentioning were about fixing problems of democracy. They weren't about addressing party decline. Referendums are devices to go around mediators like parties. So parties are supposed to be mediators. And if you want things direct, and you say, we don't want the mediators, that's taking the parties out of the picture. Primary is the same way. And I stand before you from a country where we have very weak parties. We have referendums, we have primaries, and we have very weak parties. And there's some correlation there that goes back 120 years to the weakening of political parties. About populist parties, you're the expert on populist parties, so I'm not going to answer this entirely, except to say your example is just right. We talk about parties in general, not about parties we like, but is the organization of a political party, is this mode of organizing. A lot of new parties call themselves social, they're movements, or they don't want to use the party label. But this party organization type, where you get your supporters organized, you get them into local councils, you have a recognizable label that's not just a person's name, this does provide some capacity to endure, and is a kind of successful party. And some of the parties that are doing this are populist. So it's, they're not. Now, do we want the only successful parties to be populist parties? No. But I think especially populist parties that aren't entirely against the democratic system shouldn't be discounted, because they are representing ideas too. They're doing what parties are supposed to be doing, and some of that then is supposed to be worked out in legislatures as these representatives represent these points of view. That's what we do. So that's quick. Great, thank you. Now how do we do this?
Yes, you may stay there on the
stay
podium.
here, okay.
I will be your sidekick here. I take now off my hat as the speaker and now as the moderator, and Annelies will help, so she will walk around with the microphone. Please wait for the microphone. Are there any burning questions? We have one here already and one in the back. Maybe. Please keep your questions fairly short so we can get more questions in.
I apologize for that. Well, thank you for the lecture. It was intellectually stimulating, at least I found that so. To open my cards, I reside now at the philosophy faculty, so I want to pose a question with regard to the concepts, the terminology through which the discussion is taking place. More precisely, what exactly do we mean by failure? So in your talk, you used different concepts of political parties. You referred to mass parties, cartel parties, catch-all parties. I might have missed another concept. And it is like customary for philosophers to say that a failure is determined with reference to an inherent or immanent goal or telos or end of the concept. And I want to propose that parties, or like some parties, the past like 30, 40 years, have been extremely successful because political apathy is not necessarily a failure if it is a strategic goal of certain parties. So if political apathy is to be viewed not as a social symptom, but as a strategic end of some political parties, in order to achieve depoliticization, in order to achieve social reproduction, in order to legitimate the increasing social inequalities or what have you, then like, why is it a failure, right? Like, how do you understand failure in this context? That's
Thank you. Did you see that coming? Philosophical question.
Philosophical question. Okay, well, let me try two things. I mean, one is I didn't choose these terms, and I did not define them, because they're just out there in the literature. So they were diagnoses that have been there without people defining them. But there were two kinds of, and so decline was this idea that parties were becoming less relevant for politics. I think that was where there had been seen that they were central to organizing and central to answering things. They were becoming sidelined, and they weren't doing a job of, citizens didn't feel connected to them, so they weren't central to parties, to citizens for organizing their political life. So that was the decline. The failure had two sides. One was parties just imploding. So they no longer stood at the next election or won votes. So that's one kind of failure, and failure to win votes, failure to endure, that people were worried about. And the other kind was failing to do their job. So they might continue, but they weren't representing. They were just off on their own doing things, but it wasn't representation. Those are two kinds of things. In terms of the second part, maybe did parties succeed because they were trying to de-energize people? Well, what we see in terms of turnout, if we think of that as the participation measure, when citizens think that the elections matter, they turn out. So in fact, citizens haven't been all that engaged. So if you look at the 2020 presidential election in the United States, really high turnout. People thought there was a difference between Trump and Biden, and they went to vote. So all that sort of, when we see high polarization, we actually see people going to vote. So it may be parties making people apathetic, or it may be people just not being too dissatisfied. So
I know Erwin, and I know he has a follow-up, but I will give the floor to someone else.
So with regards to the parties, with the example of the four populist parties and the prediction that there will be a reduction perhaps in their numbers in future, my question was, why is it that we seem more common to see a party splitting? So you would have a blue party that becomes a cyan party and a turquoise party, as opposed to a blue and red party merging to form a purple party, for example. So with the populists, why is there this prediction that maybe there'll be less of them, as opposed to these four combining forces into some greater thing? Because the trend does seem to be that we're having more and more parties. So the question is, I guess, why are we having more instead of merging into?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, actually. I will give it a try, but maybe you can fill in. But I think in general, parties tend to only join forces when they have their back against the wall. So we see it now with the Labour Party and the Green Left Party in the Netherlands. It's not a marriage of love necessarily. It's a marriage of necessity, because they're shrinking and they need each other in order to form some sort of weight. Parties splintering, on the other hand, especially in the Netherlands, we see that a lot. There are a lot of discussions about raising the electoral threshold. We need a kiesdrempel because it will finally bring some order into parliament. I think that's not the solution. I think the solution would be to have stricter rules on this splitting off. Infighting happens a lot, especially for new parties. New parties tend to really fight internally when there are leadership, especially when there are alpha males involved. It tends to be particularly interesting. catfights that happen and then parties split, and we don't have rules for that. So once they've entered the threshold, then we see a lot of splitting. Why they don't join forces, I think that you should really ask these parties. I think they should. I mean, if they want to have more electoral weight, they should. But I don't see that happening.
So I'll give it just a comparative perspective.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, the Netherlands, it's weird, it's very low threshold. It makes it very easy for people in politics to say, no, I don't like what's going on, I'm going to take my marbles and I'm going to go there. So it does encourage that more than in other systems. Also, there's sort of a comparative perspective that I don't know all that well, but Latin American parties have a lot of splittering going on. And one argument about what's going on and why some parties see less splittering than others and why some systems see less splitting is the question is how, if you're a party elite, what's the chance, and you want to get to the top, how open are those procedures to get from the bottom to the top? And they refer to the person who wrote this referred to it as party vibrancy and said that more vibrant parties actually have good career paths that lead to the top so that elites don't feel, even if they didn't win this time, they might get to the top sometime. So there's a reason to stay in and to be part of that party label and to all the work that's gone into investing in loyalty so far for that party, that's valuable to them and they'll stay in and keep working for it. So I don't know how well that applies, but it has something to do with also, what's the cost if you want to be in charge of your own party to form a party? What's the likelihood that you can win? And what's the likelihood you can win if you stay inside and just wait another 5 years?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense also for the Dutch case. Yeah. More questions?
Did you just pass a woman for me?
Yeah, yes, but I will come back to that.
Okay, yeah. Make sure you come back to her. So the question that I have is, when it comes to failure, there's one particular thing that I'm missing in the story, and that's the difference that Peter Mayer observed at the end of his life, namely the difference between responsible and responsive government. And that he saw a trend that parties who used to be able to both respond to societal dissatisfaction and be responsible governors. And he observed that in the last decades, there were parties that are responsible, that are able to govern, that are able to play the political game according to the rules, and there are parties that are able to respond to political dissatisfaction, mobilize on new issues. And he saw those two things growing apart. And in particular, we see that in the Netherlands, that there are parties that mobilize satisfied voters, and there are parties that mobilize dissatisfied voters. And I think when we talk about the failure of the system, this is the thing I'm most worried about. I mean, in many ways, your story is about, okay, since the 1990s, everything is stable. It's also partially a Leonie story, but I think this growing apart of responsiveness and responsibility is a trend where we think about the ability of the system to really deal with dissatisfaction. If those two things grow apart, shouldn't we be worried about that?
Yeah, I'm not going to give you a good answer. I mean, it's a good question. I mean, there's this kind of wider sense of, can anybody govern? Does it matter? And that's a kind of, but I think, again, I don't quite know what it would look like, but this idea of, I think it is up to parties to present that it's difficult to answer all the solutions, but still but our system of government is democratic for a reason, and we are doing what we can. I mean, they have to push back against this sort of nihilist narrative, but also the outsiders, once they're insiders, they're not going to do any better, right? I mean, it's easy to say they should all do something else until you're elected, and then you're like, oh dear, what do we do? So I do think there are, government's hard. There are challenges. There are real challenges. But that's part of the art of politics. I mean, I don't think it says, well, it would be impossible for anybody to ever solve this. It's about mobilizing people, about helping educate them. This is the challenges we face, but still we're doing better. So I don't think to say that it's impossible, even if nobody's done a great job of it. You have to trust voters to be able to realize that they can't get everything. They're adults, but they can get part of what they want. That doesn't.
He doesn't look.
He doesn't look
convinced. That is also something we save for later. Then I would like to give Joanna the word. Wait for the microphone.
Yes, thank you for the very interesting talk and discussion. So I come from Poland, and as you might know, last month we had the elections, and we had the highest voter turnout in our history. Almost 75% people have been waiting in queues for up to 5 hours just to be able to vote. And I was listening to your talk about, the party decline, just wondering why, what happened in Poland happened, and most of the votes in these elections also went to the two biggest parties, actually. So at the end of this, I must say, while I find your argument about, identity creation being very important, parties needing to pay more attention to it, to those narratives very compelling, I have to also wonder how much of this identity creation has to rely on really strong demonization of the enemy and creating really strong antagonisms for it to really catch on and mobilize people.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I don't know, but I don't know that it has to be only based on the enemy. And I think some of it's traditionally come from being allied with social movements or with civil society groups. I mean, it's not that parties are doing it on their own, and those groups which are demonizing others aren't doing it on their own either. They're doing it with the help of the media, and so. Again, it's not up to the parties can't do it by themselves. They aren't able to create these messages and these norms of what should parties be doing and how far should you go. I don't think it's an easy task, but I just don't. And I don't know if I'm right on this, that parties can do it. But I think ceding the ground to the parties that want to demonize the other and that get their identity only through their own victimhood. I mean, I don't think that's the long-term solution is to say that, well, everybody else is not going to have an identity, and the only people who feel like waving a flag are a certain small group, and the rest of us don't quite know where we fit.
Are there any more questions? Yes, we have time for two more questions, I would say.
Okay, so in the Dutch case, I'm not very well versed in other European political parties and how they're organized. But one of the most stable political parties in the Netherlands, I think, for the last 20 years is the Party for Freedom of Gerrit Wilders. But his party only has one member, and that is Geert Wilders. So I'm wondering how you would do research on party membership and participation with such a political party who has no members, or even maybe in the case of the elitist corruption, maybe you can be corrupt if you have no subsidy rules to adhere to. So I'm wondering what your take on this case is.
Yeah, it's a good challenging case, and one political scientists like because it's this party without members. So we love it as an example. I guess there are two things. I mean, it has gotten loyalty for what it stands for, and I do think that. Your newest party we're talking about, I can't say his name.
Baudet? Thierry Baudet?
No.
Or Pieter Omtzigt. You're talking about Omtzigt.
Yeah, it's too many consonants for me. But it's a good example of a party that people have felt, they're not feeling attracted to the party, but they're feeling attracted to the leader, and it does defy these expectations that, well, what people really want is that they have internally democratic procedures for selecting candidates. No, I mean, that was selected by the leader. This party was ahead in the polls before it had a manifesto or statutes or candidates, right? So it does sort of defy these questions of like, well, do people care about the procedures? No, but you can study people based on, and we do study people who are supporters, and are they active in parties, and are they connected to the party through social media? We do study those kind of things as political scientists. And I've written a whole book called Beyond Party Members. So I think you can study people who are active in parties but aren't actually party members.
Maybe just to add, because it's such a nice case study, it's such a deviant case, we love it for comparisons. So the Netherlands, I showed, we have 4 populist radical right parties, and the big question, of course, that emerges is how can parties that have the same ideology, more or less, have such different organizational models, and why do they do that? Why do they choose different organizational models? So Wilders clearly chose that model for a reason, to stop infighting, which happened in the case of Fortuyn. Baudet said, well, then you also lose a lot of income. We want the money. So then Baudet said, let's get lots of members, but let's not give them actually voting rights or any say. So they're basically a cash cow for financing, and it provides great comparative analysis for people like me who study parties. Final question. I see one here. We'll take 2. We take 2. Why not?
So, hello. First of all, thank you. Of course, in Netherlands and the US, we've got like 2 far sides of the spectrum when it comes to amount of parties. Like we've got a very binary system on one side and a very fragmentized system on the other side, both of which offer their own issues. Would you say there's like an inherently healthy amount of parties?
That's a great question.
And,
I'll leave that for you.
And which one of us comes closer, basically?
Yeah, I mean, it's the Goldilocks, right? Somewhere in the middle. I think having good party entry is healthy. But the U.S., because it has these open primaries, in some ways the parties have changed. The labels have stayed the same, but the parties have changed. So, I'm not sure if you looked at what parties stood for the past 100 years, that you would say we only had 2 parties. So that's one answer I would give.
And there's something called the paradox of choice, that when you have a toothpaste aisle and there are 50 cases of toothpaste and you just think, why so many cases I can't choose? And oftentimes when I speak to Americans at conferences, they will say, you have too many choices, that's not good. I would choose this any day over just having 2 choices. I would rather have 25 or 37 parties to choose from than just 2.
And I'd say that one of the reforms in the U.S. that's being now pushed by some people and may go ahead is something they have in New York State already, which is to have fusion voting, which allows in New York State, for instance, they have the Working Families Party, which cross-endorses Democratic, but not every Democratic candidate. So there's a price to pay. I mean, you have to, but both parties, if you vote for the Working Party candidate or you vote for the Democratic Party candidate, all the votes go to me because I'm the candidate endorsed by both parties. But when there's an important issue, that party the Working Families Party can say, Susan, 35% of your vote last time came from our party, and this was our #1 issue. So it's sort of like having organized factions. This is a practice that existed in the U.S. until about 1900, and then the dominant parties, this is the cartel party argument, sort of, the dominant parties said, no, we don't like that. You can't have cross-endorsement. There's now New Jersey, for instance, it's before the New Jersey Supreme Court, State Supreme Court, to allow them to bring it back, to say this is unconstitutional to ban this kind of cross-endorsement. Also in Michigan, there's some. So there's an idea that, well, there's a way that we could have our cake and eat it too. We'll have 2 parties, sort of, but also we'll have these organized factions so that you can have the left wing of the Democratic Party and the centrist wing and the right wing Republicans and centrist Republicans.
I didn't know this yet. That's really interesting. Oh. Final question. Lots of pressure for the final question.
Okay, it's my honor. The title tonight is, Are the political parties fit for the future? So my question is, what happens if they are not? Or the consequence?
We'll take that.
Could do rock, paper, scissors over this.
Well, I think parties are pretty persistent. I mean, I think I think we do, I mean, the parties, I mean, I'm sort of at the, well, I study parties, so there'll be something to study. Just like for your center, there'll be something to study. Will we have good government is a sort of bigger question. I think we'll have parties. Will we have good government is another. And I think that it's good that the Netherlands is thinking about, is there a way to limit the number of parties? Because I do think for coalition formation, there can be too many parties, and it makes it hard for voters to cast intelligent votes. If you don't know something about what the likely coalitions are, it is hard to have that link between what voters want and what comes out the other end. So our parties fit, I mean, but yes, but I think having too many parties could be a problem. So we don't want too many. Is that, you know, but watch the space because Netherlands is sort of interesting. Yeah. But it makes your life hard. Let's put it that way.
Or interesting. Or interesting. To end on a positive note.
On a positive note.
That was a great final question. So on that note, I would like to thank everyone for being here, for such great questions. I also want to encourage you to go to next week's lecture. There's a Studium Generale lecture next week on the role of rhetoric in politics by my colleague Jelte Olthoff on the 14th of November. So do sign up for that. It is in Dutch. And I think Annelies has a little gift for Susan, also to thank you. And please join me in thanking Susan for a wonderful contribution tonight. Thank you all. Yeah, we'll bring it to Gerrit. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Time well spent.